Part 6. He entered the convenience store once again, mulling over the spectacular failure of the delayed sleep experiment, and wondered if the advice in the library text was no more than an uptown version of the folk remedies his acquaintances seemed so eager to press upon him. It was an unpleasant idea, but he thought his mind, or the force below his mind which was actually in charge of this slow torture, had sent him a message which was even more unpleasant. You have a sleep window, Ralph. It ain't as big as it once was, and it seems to be getting smaller with every passing week. But you better be grateful for what you've got, because a small window is better than no window at all. You see that now, don't you? Yes, Ralph mumbled as he walked down the center aisle to the bright red cup of soup boxes. I see that very well. Sue, the afternoon counter girl, laughed cheerfully. You must have money in the bank, Ralph, she said. Beg pardon? Ralph didn't turn. He was inventorying the red boxes. Here was onion, split pea, the beef and noodles combo. But where the fuck was the chicken and rice? My mom always said people who talk to themselves have... Oh my God! For a moment, Ralph thought she had simply made a statement a little too complex for his tired brain to immediately grasp. Something about how people who talk to themselves have found God, and then she screamed. He had hunkered down to check the boxes on the bottom shelf, and the scream shot him to his feet so hard and fast that his knees popped. He wheeled toward the front of the store, bumping the top shelf of the soup display with his elbow and knocking half a dozen red boxes into the aisle. Sue, what's wrong? Sue paid no attention. She was looking out through the door with her fisted hands pressed against her lips and her brown eyes huge above them. God, look at the blood! She cried in a choked voice. Ralph turned farther, knocking a few more Lipton boxes into the aisle, and looked through the Red Apple's dirty shop window. What he saw drew a gasp from him, and it took him a space of seconds, 5 maybe, to realize that the bloody, beaten woman staggering toward the Red Apple was Helen Deepno. Ralph had always thought Helen the prettiest woman on the west side of town, but there was nothing pretty about her today. One of her eyes was puffed shut. There was a gash at her left temple that was soon going to be lost in the gaudy swelling of a fresh bruise. Her puffy lips and her cheeks were covered with blood. The blood had come from her nose, which was still leaking. She wolfed through the Red Apple's little parking lot toward the door like a drunk, her one good eye seeming to see nothing. It simply stared. More frightening than the way she looked was the way she was handling Natalie. She had the squalling, frightened baby slung casually on one hip, carrying her as she might have carried her books to school 10 or 12 years before. Oh, Jesus, you said you dropped the kids! Sue screamed. But although she was 10 steps closer to the door than he was, she made no move. Simply stood where she was with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes gobbling up her face. Ralph didn't feel tired anymore. He sprinted up the aisle, tore open the door, and ran outside. He was just in time to catch Helen by the shoulders as she banged a hip against the ice cabinet, mercifully not the hip with Natalie on it, and went veering off in a new direction. Helen! He yelled. Jesus, Helen, what happened? Huh? She asked, her voice dully curious, totally unlike the voice of the lively young woman who sometimes accompanied him to the movies and moaned over Mel Gibson. Her gray eye rolled toward him and saw that same dull curiosity in it, a look that said she didn't know who she was, let alone where she was or what happened or when. Huh. Ralph. What? The baby slipped. Ralph let go of Helen, grabbed for Natalie, and managed to snag one of the bumper straps. Nat screamed, waved her hands, and stared at him with huge dark blue eyes. He had his other hand between Nat's legs, an instant before the strap he was holding tore free. For a moment, the howling baby bounced on his hand like a gymnast on a balance beam, and Ralph could feel the damp bulge of her diapers through the overalls she was wearing. Then he slipped his other hand around her back and hoisted her up against his chest. His heart was pounding hard, and even with the baby safe in his arms, he kept seeing her slip away, kept seeing her head with its cap of fine hair slamming against the butt-littered pavement with a sickening crap. "Hum? Are? Ralph?" Helen asked. She saw Natalie in Ralph's arms, and some of the dullness went out of her good eye. She raised her hands toward the child, and in Ralph's arms, Natalie mimicked the gesture with her own chubby hands. Then Helen staggered, struck the side of the building, and reeled backward a step. One foot tingled in the other. Ralph saw splatters of blood in her small white sneakers, and it was amazing how bright everything was all of a sudden. The color had come back into the world, at least temporarily, or she would have fallen if Sue hadn't picked the moment to finally venture out. Instead of going down, Helen landed against the opening door and just leaned there like a drunk against the lamppost. "Ralph?" The expression in her eyes was a little sharper now, and Ralph saw it wasn't so much curiosity as incredulity. She drew in a deep breath and made an effort to force intelligible words past her swelled lips. Give me my baby. Baby. Give me Natalie." "Not just yet, Helen," Ralph said. "You're not too steady on your feet right now." Sue was still on the other side of the door, holding it so Helen wouldn't fall. The girl's cheeks and forehead were ashy pale, her eyes filled with tears. "Get out here," Ralph told her. "Hold her up." "I can't," she blubbered. "She's all bloody." "Oh, for God's sake, quit it. It's Helen. Helen, keep me from up the street." And although Sue must have known that, actually hearing the name seemed to turn the trick. She slipped around the open door. When Helen staggered backward again, Sue curled an arm around her shoulders and braced her firmly. That expression of incredulous surprise remained on Helen's face. Ralph found it harder and harder to look at. It made him feel sick to his stomach. "Ralph, what happened? Was it an accident?" He turned his head and saw Bill McGovern standing at the edge of the parking lot. He was wearing one of his natty blue shirts with the iron creases still on the sleeves and holding one of his long-fingered, oddly delicate hands up to shade his eyes. He looked strange, somehow naked that way, but Ralph had no time to think about why. Too much was happening. It was no accident, he said. "She's been beaten up. Here, take the kid." He held Natalie out to Bill, who at first shrank back and then took the baby. Natalie began to shriek again immediately. Bill, looking like someone who has just been handed an overfilled airstick bag, held her out at arm's length with her feet dangling. Behind him, a small crowd was beginning to gather, many of them teenage kids in baseball uniforms on their way home from an afternoon game at the field around the corner. They were staring at Helen's puffed and bloody face with an unpleasant avidity, and Ralph found himself thinking of the Bible story about the time Noah had gotten drunk. The good son who had looked away from the naked old man lying in his tent, but the bad one who had looked. Gently replaced Sue's arm with his own. Helen's good eye rolled back to him. She said his name more clearly this time, more positively, and the gratitude Ralph heard in her blurry voice made him feel like crying. "Sue, take the baby. Bill doesn't have a clue." She did, folding Nat gently and expertly into her arms. Bill gave her a grateful smile, and Ralph suddenly realized what was wrong with the way he looked. Bill wasn't wearing his Panama hat, which seemed as much a part of him in the summertime at least as the wine on the bridge of his nose. "Hey, mister, what happened?" one of the baseball kids asked. "Nothing that's any of your business," Ralph said. "Looks like she went a few rounds with Riddick Bowe." "Nah, Tyson," one of the other baseball kids said, and incredibly, there was laughter. "Get out of here!" Ralph shouted at them, suddenly furious. "Go get all your papers. Mind your business." They shuffled back a few steps, but no one left. It was blood they were looking at and not in the movie screen. "Helen, can you walk?" "Yes," she said. Think so." He led her carefully around the open door and into the Red Apple. She moved slowly, shuffling from foot to foot like an old woman. The smell of sweat and spent adrenaline was beaking out of her pores in a sour reek, and Ralph felt his stomach turn over again. It wasn't the smell, not really. It was the effort to reconcile this Helen with the pert and pleasantly sexy woman he had spoken to yesterday while she worked in her flower beds. Ralph suddenly remembered something else about yesterday. Helen had been wearing blue shorts cut quite high, and he had noticed a couple of bruises on her legs, a large yellow blotch far up on the left thigh, a darker, fresher smudge on the right calf. He walked Helen toward the little office area behind the cash register. He glanced up at the convex anti-theft mirror mounted in the corner and saw Bill holding the door for Sue. "Lock the door," he said over his shoulder. "Geez, Ralph, I'm not supposed to—" "Just for a couple of minutes," Ralph said. "Please." "Well, okay, I guess." Ralph heard the snick of the bolt being turned as he eased Helen into the hard plastic contour chair behind the literary desk. He picked up the telephone and punched a button marked 911. Before the phone could ring on the other end, a blood-streaked hand reached out and pushed down the gray disconnect button. "Don't! Ralph!" She swallowed with an obvious effort and tried again. "Don't!" "Yes," Ralph said. "I'm going to." Now it was fear he saw in her one good eye and nothing dull about it. "No," she said. "Please, Ralph, don't." She looked past him and held out her hands again. The humble, pleading look on her beaten face made Ralph wince with dismay. "Ralph?" She wants the baby. "I know, go ahead." Sue handed Natalie to Helen, and Ralph watched as the lady, a little over a year now, he was pretty sure, put her arms around her mother's neck and her face against her mother's shoulder. Helen kissed the top of Nat's head. It clearly hurt her to do this, but she did it again and then again. Looking down at her, Ralph could see blood grimed into the faint creases on the nape of Helen's neck like dirt. As he looked at this, he felt the anger to begin to pulse again. "It was Ed, wasn't it?" he asked. "Of course it was. You didn't hit the cut-off button on the phone when someone tried to call 911 if you had been beaten up by a total stranger, but he had to ask." "Yes," she said. Her voice was no more than a whisper. The answer to her secret imparted into the fine cloud of her baby daughter's hair. "Yes, it was Ed, but you can't call the police." She looked up, the good eye full of fear and misery. "Please don't call the police, Ralph. I can't bear to think Natalie's dad in jail for... Helen burst into tears. Natalie goggled at her mother for a moment in comic surprise and then joined her.